Danny Thompson had always hated gym class, but more than anything he hated about his gym class was his gym teacher, Mr. Kirby. All that Danny wanted to do was to go home to his computer so he could look at the live streaming video of the corpse he had found in the woods. Instead, he was forced to run the mile. The unseasonably hot October day, the mercury was stretching up over the 80s and into 90, and Mr. Kirby had decided to finish his 11 o'clock class by having the boys run the mile. Now at 11:45, all the others were finished, just smiling around waiting for Danny. Danny struggled around the track, his sneakers beating against the hot asphalt. His thighs burned, his chaffed on from the coarse texture of the gym shorts that were too big for him had always threatened to fall down. The sweat stung his eyes, liquored his nose, so his glasses would slip down his face. The air felt like his fire was fire in his lungs as he panted and he fought for breath. Yet he smiled. For his mind, all he could see was his beautiful blonde girl lying there dead in the duff in the redwood forest. The curve of her hips and the tilt of her breasts and the black mound of her hair in the triangular space where her legs met, pale cerulean blue and perfect in every day, besides her torn out throat and missing arm. "Hustle, hustle, and hold your head up when you run!" Mr. Kirby shouted at Danny as he came along lopping around the bend, pushing his glasses back up. "Put some hustle into it!" Mr. Kirby barked, clapping his baseball mitt-sized hands together before lifting that awful whistle to his thick lips and giving the free curt, shrill shrieks that never failed to make Danny shudder. Mr. Kirby was a massive man, with his arms like tree trunks and a giant head he had kept shaved, bald, and gleaming. That huge head of his sat on top of his shoulders like an unsteady boulder on top of the mountain, and he had a strange habit of snarling, his upper lip rising contemptuously up like an animal-like sneer, even when he was smiling, and even when he encapsulated his speech with a fierce growl. "Put a little more effort into it, Thompson!" Always referring to Danny as his last name, as if he were the military and he was the drill sergeant. The words ringing out with minutes of guard dogs' bark. Danny just glared silently back at him. To Danny and Mr. Kirby was just another lifelong of bullies that had taunted him his whole life. Danny had always been smaller than the other boys his age, and myopathic, having to endure wearing one of the thick glasses, as well as the taunts that ensured from them. 4 eyes, big eyes, bubbles orb boy from the 3rd grade onward. To make matters worse, his fierce intelligence, IQ 165, that had crushed him to skip and caused him to skip 7th grade to go right into 8th grade from 6th. So now then, his sophomore year, he was not only much smaller than the rest, but he was also much slower and less coordinated. A trait in his gym teacher, Mr. Kirby, never let him forget. Come on, move it, Thompson! At least finish for God's sake!" Danny finally stumbled over the marker, hunched over and exhausted, pretending to notice the way the older boys were looking at him, as if he were some kind of pathetic cripple or invalid to be pitied and secretly mocked. All right, hit the showers, everyone," Mr. Kirby blowed out, with a weird sneer that exposed the crannies from the left side of his mouth, slapping his hands together loudly before placing them firmly comfortably on his hips, with his elbows jutted out. The boys tooling over the track started hooting and hollering, making their way to the locker room. Danny followed, trailing behind them, head down, steadying his feet as they shuffled with him along the ground to the hall to his locker. He sat sullenly on the concrete bench and silently slipped out of his gym clothes and into his black jeans and white button-up shirt, ignoring the other boys who had sauntered him in the showers with towels tied around their waists, laughing and wisecracking with each other. Danny never took a shower after gym class. The idea of being exposed before the others, wet, naked, on a vulnerable tent, filled him with dread and anxiety. Danny had moved to California from Oregon a little over a year ago when his mother had left his father after a practically loud and nasty fight. The neighbors had called the cops, and Danny had to watch as a swirl in his red and blue spinning lights as the police had led his father away in handcuffs. In the morning that his mother packed up in the old buckscreen station wagon and taken Danny and his 6-year-old sister down to California, to the little college town of Artica, to now start getting the hell out of Oregon before Danny's father had even the chance to make bail and talk her out of it. And it was a new start. Everything was new, though not necessarily for the better in Danny's opinion. His mother had always become somewhat of a new age hippie. Now, instead of the jeans and sweatshirt she had worn daily in blending with all the other redneck moms, she wore long flowing dresses with floral prints, an anklet of bells, an amethyst necklace, and there were crystals and scented candles everywhere. She got a job at the big co-op health food store and started taking classes on herbalism. Worse yet, had taken off the hefty lesbian over a named Gail, who had behaved exactly like her in every regard. Then there was this new school, Arca High. The kids there were hipsters, not like rednecks. Danny was used to. They used to listen to strange music he was unfamiliar with, dubstep and crust punk, and felt him like alienated from when he did hear from the hicks that he had despised back in the Bend for the being ignorant backwood morons. Most of the time Danny's presence in his new school was an invisible one. He easily passed all of his classes without even trying to subject any interest in him that was at all sure to receive an A. But he could be moody and swirly to all of his teachers, a disdainful arguing some obscure point between them, one that was inevitably always right about, and more often than that he would not only irate them to the point where they just barely passed him with a C, but most were content just to leave him alone to brood to stare off into space. But gym class was different. It was the only place where he didn't seem to easily excel, one place where he was called out again and again in front of his peers when Mr. Kirby would harshly tell him to put some effort and hustle into it or follow through with his swing, nodding his plump eyeballs peering out from his big bald head in search of students who agreed. Jocks who concurred, Danny would feel like some nocturnal insect exposed to daylight. The rock that hit him so suddenly lifted so he was left squirming into the bright light sunlight, a riffing, ugly creature trying to scamper off into the darkness and seclusion to where he felt safe. The first time he had read Metamorphosis, he knew exactly what Kafka was talking about. When Gregor Samsa woke up in the morning from unsettling dreams, he found himself changed into a monstrous vermin. Danny was very familiar with the sensation. It was silent, sturdy, and Danny was in the hospital reading Philip Carlo's The Night Stalker from the 4th time, and a streetcar named Desiree was being at the school play that year by a group of girls near him, pratted him about the girl who had just gotten the lead role of Stella. Can you believe the credence that got the lead? Was the one only chewing gum and twisting the lock of hair around her finger, whispered conspiratically. She was, so ugly as if in her life. I mean, just a year ago, she was the ugliest girl in the school. A dog, an utter dog. A clown dog, no less. And now she's gotten the lead role. I know, right? Listening to them, Danny came underneath the distinctive impression that one of them had ever read the Tennessee Williams play and pushed his glasses up to his nose, slammed his book shut with a little to no flourish, got up, and sulked over to a corner seat where he could read in quiet. Danny loved the library, the comforting smell of old books, the quiet, the studious manner of the place that's affected, the kindness of the gentle old librarians would show when they saw you truly loved books and where to read. study and reflect, he settled happily into the corner seat, surrounded by the long vertical spines of familiar volumes that he had become like old friends to him. He looked out like the other students, splayed in the wooden chairs, and spied on long-haired kid in faded black slayer shirt, reading into Stephen King book It. What a fool, he thought, reading about an alien clown named Pennywise. That was scary. What Danny was reading out was real. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Here was a real monster, someone who, under the cover of the night's darkness, watched you through your window as you slept, then crept silently into your room while you were blissfully lost in some dream, utterly unaware of death's presence, sneaking up on you from the form of the madman Satanist. The lucky were executed, and quickly, with a gunshot to the head. The unlucky were tortured, violated, their eyes ripped from their heads, their blood spilled out where they used satanic messages and pentagrams on the walls. This was real. There was no rationalizing it, no denying it, doubting it. That was a fact. Danny was obsessed with serial killers. He could tell you the exact number of bodies found in John Wayne Gacy's crawl space. The names of the girls Ted Bundy had squirreled away to secret locations for his nocturnal, disgusting acts. The names of the ones that were left for dead. Where were they? Heads were smashed open. He could tell you all what bones Edgin used for fashion into lamps. The various means of torture on the hillside stranglers used in their victims. In the date of Albert Fish's birth and the date of his execution. He devoured true crime books, and more heinous and grisly for the bitter. His room was littered with the stacks of them. The best, like Anne Rule's Stranger Beside Me and Robert Graysmith's Zodiac. He had so many times that he could quote passages from verbatim. It was then his grandmother who had sparked an interest in true crime, and her death had been fueled his compulsion, for he had inherited all of her books. The death of his grandmother, his mother's mother, was a terrible blow. He had been very close to her, to the point where she was like almost a second mother to him. His mother would have a fight with his dad and dump him off at his grandmother's, or his mother would be making up with his dad, dumping him off with his grandmother. Granny Galloway was one who took him to the mall, bought him clothes to wear, games for his Wii, notebooks, pencils for school. Well, she was the one who fostered his love for reading. It was her copy of In the Blood Cold, sitting formally in dust-covered shelf, that had started this whole true crime obsession. When Danny brought the hardcover book to its black paper cover to his grandmother, who was slouched over as Agatha Christie book in her love seat, her winced face grew serious when she told him, traman capote. Danny, this is an important piece. It was the first true crime book, but also a work of literature. He nodded thoughtfully, pushed his glasses up to his nose, sat down beside his grandmother, and began to read out loud the minds of ruthless killers. He hadn't stopped since. When his grandmother laid out his sister, as she was too young to attend the wake, but Danny was deemed mature enough and dressed in a somber navy blue shirt that was too big for him and drooped over his shoulders. He was taken to the funeral home. His mother had led him dimly to a lit back room that smelled of old wood and flowers with a faint whiff of Lysol. This was surreal. People were eating potato salad off of paper plates and plastic forks and laughing at it like it was a picnic. Older gray-haired people he didn't even recognize kept coming up to him and hugging him and shaking his head. That was when they were telling him how much he had grown since he had matured and how he looked. His suit, on the other hand, was hanging off of him, so he felt like a midget. His uncles, his mother's two older brothers, were passing a flask back and forth and talking loudly almost to old girlfriends in their miraculous childhood. When they tried to pass the flask to Danny, his mother scolded them. "Don't you dare!" and pushed Danny away. And there at the front of the hall, what happened to be Danny to be some kind of tiny strange altar, was his grandmother lying sincerely in a half-closed coffin. Her face and hands had bared down, but her lower half covered in cold steel. People wandered up to the casket, whispered to her if she could hear them, and he was surprised by how they would touch and fondle her, squeezing her hand and kissing her neck, caressing her face, and tucking a lock of gray-blue hair behind her ear. His mother pushed him forward towards the casket. "Go on," she said. "Say goodbye. Say goodbye to your grandma." Her face twisted with grief as she dabbed the handkerchief to her eyes. Danny stumbled forward, apprehensive and a little scared. He stepped up to the casket and stared down at his grandmother. She had on too much makeup, and it was smeared and smudged to where the mourners and had pressed her lips against hers and run the fingers over her face, staring down at the lifeless corpse of his woman she had meant too much for him, changed him in some identifiable way, so he couldn't explain it. It was his grandmother, whom he had loved and adored, yet it was not her at all, just a shell. He wanted to touch her, as the others did, but he was scared to touch the dead thing before him. He wanted to cry. He felt like it was expected of him, but he found that what he could do nothing but turn, push his glasses up to his nose, and shuffle back to his seat, with his head bent down. Then that lonely summer, when no school and no friends, he had lounged for that house for reading his trove of true crime books he had salvaged from his grandmother's estate. It was then that hot Mackinac summer that he discovered Charlie Manson family and messed up stuff. He had found that black book, dripping with blood letters pattered on the cardboard box. His mother hadn't gotten around to taking it to the thrift store. Lying on that bed that night with the flashlight and that musty dog-eared copy of Hitler's Skittler that had once belonged to his grandmother, the covers pulled up to his head, he read about the family's acid-fueled, really pretty much messed up stuff, flipping back and forth from photos and letting those lost hippie girls to descriptions and of the forced nations of violence. He found his right hand, his hand clasped over the book in a death grip, slipping it down between his legs. And that's when, in love, there's no wrong, the family preached. The pale moonlight streaming down through his bedroom window as his coat as he huddled, the blanket covered in form of silver. He gazed down at the small black and white photo of the beautiful Ruth Ann Morehouse in overalls with an X carved onto her forehead. He shuddered and looked over. He shut his eyes and lay back towards the pillow. Visions of wild-eyed and raven-haired Susan Atkins licking the blood off the knife as she used to slaughter Sharon Tate, circling around his head in the shot. And of course, that's when he looked up. That night he had dreamed of hippie girls with X's carved into their heads. They were really messed up, and it honestly was too messed up to describe it. The day he found the dead girl lying in that corpse of Adler, and had started out as a bad day. The night before, he had gone into a wicked fight with his mother in the morning. She had told him where he was going to be severe repercussions. Danny didn't know what that meant exactly, and he had suspected correctly that she didn't either. But he was worried on how she would take away some of his internet time. The incident, as Danny's mother called it, had happened at dinner. His mother's partner, Gail, was there. Big woman with ballistically moo baking tofu, although Danny hated tofu. Steaming kale, the only thing Danny hated worse than tofu was kale, and spouting out nonstop of positive energy vibrations. Now this kale has grown on a botanical farm which means the seeds were planted from a new moon and it was harvested on the moon, soaking up the natural vibrations and rhythms of Gaia, our Earth Mother. She said as she laid the dishes laden with the steaming food before each of them. His mother nodded, along with everything Gail said, whispering, "Blessed be," when Gail set her food down in front of her. Danny looked down at his plate with disgust and just ignored the hippie dribble. But what he couldn't ignore was his sister, of how she was just eating this perfectly aged family bullshit up. Melissa was just so damn happy that she didn't even realize how far away from home that they were, how alien this house was in town were, and if she didn't realize that they would barely or never see their father again, or that their mother had turned into a hippie lesbian, she just sat there with a stupid grin and started talking to Gail about birthday parties, bouncing her head back and forth as her pigtails would jiggle up and down. "So Allison's having an ice cream cake and a sleepover. Jenny's mom says a sleepover is too much, but she's going to have a clown and a magician. Of course, I was invited to both parties, but Karen wasn't. Jenny hates Karen." Danny sullenly pushed back a hunk of tofu freely into a muddy puddle of Thai peanut sauce, running up to the green lump of kale back, his elbow resting on his table, his chin pierced at his fist. When Melissa finally stopped her drabble on the whole various birthday parties in the neighborhood, he turned to her, pushed his glasses up to his nose, and said, "Well, that's very interesting. So what kind of ice cream cake and all? However, I was wondering just how well you and your friends did with the fact that we are all going to die. Do you have your little parties, or just try to ignore it? Some festive occasion, just to take the impending fate of the grave off of your mind? Or has that actually never crossed your little sweet pea brain that one day we'll be dead?" "Danny!" his mother shouted, slamming her fork down. "Stop that!" Gail blurted out with a quick giggle, then covered her grin with a napkin. "What?" Danny shouted. "It's the truth! Grandma's dead, and the odds are mathematically that you're going to die next, Mom." He then turned to his head to gaze at his sister, dramatically pushed his glasses up, his nose and squinting his eyes, murmured with a low, quiet voice, "And then you, Melissa." Melissa's big eyes, filled with tears and lower lip began to quiver. "Mommy, you're not going to die, are you?" Gail calmly popped a piece of tofu, dripping it with sauce into her mouth while chewing it loudly, lips smacking stand. Well, I say death is another for change, and when that time comes, I will welcome as it was part of my soul's journey." Melissa's eyes grew wider and wider, tears brimming until they began to flow down her cheeks. Then she let out a terrible wail and shouted, "I don't want to die! I don't want Mommy to die!" Danny's mother flew down her napkin, pushed her chair, and quickly strode over to the little girl, wrapping her arms around her, pressing her face into a knot woe against her belly, slowly rocking her and stroking her. "Shh, Mommy's fine. Nothing's going to happen to Mommy." She shot an angry glance at Danny, hissing, "Look what you have done." "Like I care," Danny shouted, leaping to his feet and knocking his chair to the ground. "You stupid fucking person. You two are disgusting, and that makes me sick. Danny, you apologize right now. This very instant. Where are you going?" But Danny wasn't listening. He was racing up the stairs to his bedroom and slamming the door. He threw himself onto the bed and buried his hand into a pillow, weeping like he wished he had never done this when his grandma died. Missing Oregon, the little house he'd grown up in, the quiet street with all the free trees, missing his father, that big curly man with a beard, mop of orange on top, who looked like he hated very much back then, whom he had feared very much back then, awakening at the night to hear him come home drunk, slamming the door, breaking things, screaming at his mother till invariably there would be a smack or the sound of his mother's weeping. The next day, at the end of English class, when the bell rang, everyone rose from their seats and started off, Danny shuffling behind them with his head down, when the teacher, Mr. Jones, called him sternly over to his desk. "Danny, I need to talk with you for a moment." Danny sighed, pushed his glasses up to his nose, and walked laboriously slow up to Mr. Jones's desk, literally dragging his feet along the linoleum. Mr. Jones was a stuffy old man with a pot belly who savored sweater jackets and with elbow patches over blazers. He had an unkempt salt and pepper mustache that he was often absent-mindedly stroking, to which that's what he was doing to his beard when he peered down at the bundles of paper on his desk, barely perspective, shaking his head back and forth with a worried, perplexed furrow to his brow. He looked up at Danny, lifting the sheaf of paper and pointing them accusingly at him. "What's this?" he asked agitatedly. Danny mumbled back, barely audible, "My English report." The report was supposed to be on the Jack London's Call of the Wind. This report is on the Mesquis de Sades, the 120 Days of Sodom, after I specifically told you that book was not even allowed in this school. Danny shrugged his shoulders. "I couldn't read Call of the Wind. London is a hack. Everyone knows that." "You could have said much in your report if you backed it up with strong evidence. It would have made a fine paper. Instead, you went and did exactly what I told you not to do. Just look at this. The metamorphosis of body going through violation and mutilation represents Sade's desire, year for caresses, and transformation. However, this fixation and violations represents the full desire to change, in that no seed will take it into anything. That would be crazy. Do you really think this is appropriate for school?" "You didn't like it?" Mr. Jones sighed, his thumb and forefinger pushed to brush his mustache. "That's not the point, Danny. Look, I'm worried about you. You're smart, so let's face it, you're a genius. But you have no discipline in whatsoever, and you're obsessed with the macabre. Do you even know what you even think about your future?" "Yeah, I guess." "You guess? What about college? Have you ever thought of that? Where are you going to go for college? Who's going to take you in if you don't get your grades up?" Danny shrugged again, picked at the spaghetti stain tarnishing the front of his shirt from lunch. "You're going to fail me? Honestly, I don't know what I'm going to do with you, but I'm going to have a conference with your mother. I've already had the discussion with Principal Stenner about this and contact your mother. We set up a date for next week." "Fucking great. What did you say to me?" "Nothing." "Look, Danny, I'm just going to pretend I didn't hear that, okay? But I'm going to expect a change in your attitude." "Yes, sir." "Good. That's more like it. Now go on to get to my next class before your bell rings." Danny purposely missed the bus after school that day, not wanting to have to go back home and deal with his mother. He had decided to cut through the woods of Redwood Park and spent the rest of the afternoon making his way up to Fickle Hill so that he would come out of the woods on the far upper end of the street and then leisurely stroll down his house. The trail that twisted through the towering redwoods like tattered brown ribbon laid on the forest floor, dotted with ferns and patches of poison oak, growing the chrism of the chilly fall mornings. The caw of ravens echoed in the stillness of the forest, spawning what looked like a meadow high up, above the embankment to the north of him. Danny decided to veer off to the trail and climb up to that spot. It appeared to be a vantage spot, a point where he ascertained that his place in the forest. Maybe he can even see the cluster of houses that made up his neighborhood. So he started up through the thicket of huckleberry, clawing his way up the summit. When he finally reached the top, he pulled himself over the lip of the ridge. He spied laying down on the edge of a small corpse of alder, simmering through a gleam of amber autumn sunlight, and piled milky image, the creamy, but of course the body of the girl lying perfectly posed, like sleeping princess from a fairy tale. He scrambled over to the edge up the incline, and to the top of momentarily, marveling and stunned at the way it lay before him. She was gorgeous, her waxen hue jeopardized by the golden gleam of her blonde hair. Everything that had once been rosy and pink on her was now a shallow hue blue. Her lips, her cheeks, and of course her Of course, she was still had not rotten yet, but didn't smell bad at all. She was fresh, a fresh kill. Her neck was thrashed and ripped open so that he could see the blanched joints of her spine behind the ravaged muscle and tendons in her throat. But her face was immaculate. Her right arm was missing, leaving a gory stump. The way it had been torn off, savagely ripped and shred, not like what the surgical precision or a scalpel or a hacksaw blade would have left. It had left him to believe that perhaps the corpse had been mauled by animals, but no. The way she was positioned, laying there flat on her back with her other arm neatly folded over her belly, legs perfectly straight, she had been placed like this, and no animal had even touched her. He glanced around, but there was no sign of a struggle here. No bloodstains, no trace of missing clothing. This was not a scene of a murderer. This was a dump site, and if anything knew anything about serial killers, he knew one thing. The killer would be back. You just couldn't take the beautiful corpse up there just to sit it out of its way, with an incredible view that you were allowed to see anyone coming. Pose the body just so, and not to expect to come back. Oh, he will be back, and Danny was for sure. And Danny wanted one thing to see it, to watch him come back to see what he did to this gorgeous corpse. The guy who was working at the security store was a jerk. Upon entering the store, Danny had marveled the interesting merchandise. All around him were gleaming of cake glasses, cases with knives, bear mice, tasers, waterproof bags, high-tech surveillance gear of all types. Danny wandered up to the front counter where it was looking at the salesman. Clearly 20s, fluff enough of burnt hair, and freckled, fumbled across over the gamer magazine. "What do you want, kid?" the man asked. "Well, I'm going to need a Raptor Wi-Fi network security system for a high-gain Yang antennae with an Omni-mast antenna. But I was wondering, do you have the standard Bullets camera with its system, or I substituted the Pi-Link Convert or Fujifilm FI 361? The guy behind the counter just stared at me blankly and muttered, "Aren't you supposed to be in school or something?" Danny was supposed to be in school, but he was skipping silently to study and hoped that no one would notice. He didn't even have time to play these games. He just pushed his glasses up his nose and placed his hands firmly on the counter and looked at the guy. "Are you the Pi-Link or the Fujifilm compatible with the Raptor Wi-Fi system, or not?" The salesman yawned, turned to page the magazine and asked, "What are you trying to do? Capture Bigfoot?" "Something like that. Now, are they compatible or not?" "You got the money for this, kid?" "Yes, I do." He had been saving his money since he was 6 years old, every penny, and now he had all of them, nearly $2,000. The guy flipped the magazine shut and stopped. "All right, kid, let me get you the system." It all went through and ran through the register. Total, the tax was replied. Danny was $6 short. "Come on," he pleaded with the guy. "Credit me $6. I swear I will pay with it back." The clerk just shook his head and opened his magazine back up. "No can do, amigo." "How about this watch then?" Danny offered. His dad had given him that watch, one of the only things he could ever remember him by. It was a cheap Casio with a calculator, not much worth than $6 used, but it meant the world to Danny. That watch isn't even worth $6. It's got a calculator. Danny pulled it off his wrist and thrust it at the guy, who took it in his hands and gave a curt voice once over. "Yeah, to tell you the truth, I kinda need a calculator watch. I have to do a lot of calculations when I'm programming. Tell you what, give me that watch for $6, you want it back for me 20 later. Deal?" Danny beamed. "Deal." Setting up the high gain antennae all the way up to the big Douglas free tree on the property of the blower where the dead girl lay. Danny heard footsteps crunching behind him. He froze, straddling to the trees, his heart pounding in his chest. Was the killer even returned? And Hiker, who had discovered the body with them there at the crime scene, setting up a surveillance system? He clung to the tree, terrified. He was too scared to move, even look down. The footsteps came closer, slowly closer until they were right below him, and then they stopped. Whoever it was right below him. He waited what seemed to be an eternity, willing for them to go on. Only silence. Finally, he chanced a furtive glance downward to see an 8-point buck below him, chewing cud. He heaved a sigh of relief. A deer. It was just a deer. The deer then stepped forward and towards the dead girl, sniffed the body curiously. As Danny scampered quickly down the tree to cast a quick glance up at him when its big black eyes darted off into the bush. Back on the trail heading home, the shadows of the towering trees were growing long and dark. The reality of the situation finally dawned on Danny, and he wondered, what the fuck am I doing? This is absolutely crazy. Should he call the cops? He would be a hero, but another part of him would make him think that his brain carried the blood and poured out of it, and of course, Danny did not know what to do. Whatever was going on down his groin, he did not want to know. What next was several days like feverish dreams. What was it that Lady Macbeth had said? What's done cannot be undone. The corpses he thought of it could send Danny into a delirium of madness. He would go through his computer, look at the peristaltic image of his security camera conjured. He would study the body with the eye of the art scholar. How she changed, glowing plump belly as gas bloated her, the skin that left her eye and beginning to wrinkle and shrivel, and so that the eye would stood out around orb, and the white of her skull would begin to show its edges. He would stare at those images. Danny was high, and morphines exploded in his head like bloodstream like fireworks. As high as any junkie or any speed freak he ever was. Mouth dry, skin sensitive, and prickly itchy. His eyes were focusing right, dilating independently, as if he had a concussion. He had grown a nasty nervous tic that spread over his face, making his whole right side comfort and twitch, and then grow numb and palsy. Image and depth of everything played through his head non-stop. Sleeping, walking, eating, studying. He would read pages of book and realize he hadn't barely taken any notice at all of what the words were. Lost in fantasies of dismemberment and carnage, he found himself giggling uncontrollably at the odd and inappropriate times, haunched with his shuffling gait, as he suffered from some strange spinal disorder. His little sister told him, "You look different. You're not the same." His old scurry self would have lashed out defensively, but the new him just laughed wickedly at him and nodded. There was no denying it. But then he began to worry. Days went on without a thing. Was the killer coming back? What he had been doing wrong? It was only going to be long before someone found her. A hiker? A troop of Boy Scouts? This had happened at the drainage ditch down in Eureka, but not that long ago. But then one day, like a revolution, he had stared at the live feed. He noticed a shadow purposely onto the frame. It darted in and out its spectacle. He squinted, pushing his glasses up to his nose, making sure it wasn't a breeze blowing out the branches of the trees. No, it was definitely a silhouette of a man. And then a figure stepped out furiously into the frame, nervously glancing at the Gargan man, head back and forth. Danny gasped at the screen, his mouth hanging open in astonishment. "No way! It's Mr. Kirby, the gym teacher!" Danny began to giggle, then began to laugh, loud bellows guffaws pouring out of him. Mr. Kirby was a psycho killer! Holy shit! Danny licked his lips, pushed his glasses to his nose. This was it. This is what he'd been waiting for. All the money and risk and preparation had been leading to. He could feel his pulse quicken and his heartbeat began to pound. He studied the screen with eager anticipation. He watched as Mr. Kirby glanced around, seemed to be uncertain that no one was around. He watched over as Mr. Kirby kneeled down, grounded beside the dead girl, tenderly lifted her head in a massive mitt of her hand, her long blonde hair trailing down between his fingers. He watched as Mr. Kirby reached into the pocket of his sweatpants, retrieved something long and cylindrical, toying with it for a moment before bringing it to the dead girl's lips. Danny focused intently on the screen. Lipstick. It was lipstick. He was spraying lipstick on the girl's lips. placing the lid back on and secretly the lip back from his pocket. Mr. Kirby then tenderly cradled the back of her neck, brought her up to a sure face up to his. Her vacant eyes began blankly into the forest, mouth gaping open, a lipstick-smeared crimson slash. He began to start doing something that Danny never expected for him to do.